And Scott, you can't help feel just a little sorry for the Loyalists, even though we would, from the perspective of the Americans, they were on the wrong side. But think of these people, most of these Loyalists, or at least a good chunk of them, had been born in America, raised in America, and now they find themselves on the wrong side of quote unquote wrong. I'm not using that as a judgmental term, but they're on the side of the British. And so when the British pull out of Philadelphia, they have no choice but to get out of there. And a lot of them are leaving their homes behind. They're leaving most of their possessions behind. They're leaving their life behind, and they're going to have to start an entirely new life somewhere else where they're not familiar with. So I do feel a little bit sorry for the Loyalists.
Yeah, and let's not forget that from the perspective of many of these people, a lot of them are probably just biding their time, seeing who's going to be successful, and then casting in their lot with the winning army because they simply want to go back to their lives and go on as they did before. Oh, the British are winning? Sure, we're loyalists just because we want to keep our life and property. It's not as if every single person in the colonies is getting fired up by rousing speeches in a Philadelphia or Boston tavern and personally heard Patrick Henry speak. Many people did feel that fire and passion, but many people didn't, and they were simply trying to live their lives. And what happens if you cast your lot in the British? Oh yeah, they're moving on Philadelphia, and then you see that the army is retreating. If you're left behind, everyone knew you to be a loyalist. Maybe you would be marked for treason. Maybe you're worried that your goods would be taken by the military. You don't know what is going to happen. And many would have been loyalists for ideological reasons, but maybe many others wouldn't. So that is a good point to make.
Exactly. And the loyalists saw themselves as the good guys. They said, hey, we're loyal to the king. We're loyal to the sovereign of this colonies. He is our ruler, and we're going to stick with him. You guys are a bunch of rebels. You're the ones that are rebelling against God's anointed ruler. So
yeah, you're the Confederate Army, the Confederate States of America, if we want to look at it that way.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, really tough place for them to be in. We saw earlier that a lot of loyalists fled Boston back in early 1776 when the British left Boston because they were surrounded by the Continentals. And here it is again, a repeated situation. It's going to happen all over the country, and especially when the war's over.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
Getting back here to Clinton and his army, word that the British were planning to leave Philadelphia reached Washington at Valley Forge as early as May, and he was joined by Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold comes to help Washington out. That's good for Washington, at least at this point. Benedict Arnold has recovered somewhat from his wounds. He's never going to be the same again. We saw that he got shot in the leg during the attack on Quebec, and then he got shot in the same place, and his horse fell down and pinned him. But Benedict Arnold's leg was never going to be the same, and it ends up being, I think it was 2 inches shorter than the leg that was good. But Benedict Arnold is there to help out Washington, and then Washington gets Charles Lee.
Yay!
Yeah, I know. Oh boy. Thanks, guys. He had been a British prisoner for 18 months, as Scott mentioned earlier. You didn't mention the 18 months part, but he'd been a prisoner for a long time. And Charles Lee, this guy, man, while he was a prisoner of the British, he gave advice to the British. He actually said, well, if I was going to, in your shoes, I would attack Washington here, and I would do this and go to this town. And can you imagine that? It's like, we actually did a discussion of this in my Facebook group, American History Fanatics, and somebody posed the question, was Charles Lee a traitor? And most people, the general consensus was not on the scale that Benedict Arnold would go on to be, but I mean, you're giving advice to the British. Now, I don't know. He might have been giving them bad advice. He might have been trying to throw them off or just telling them what they wanted to hear just to improve his situation as a captive. Who knows?
Maybe he was just biding his time and thought, okay, if things go really bad for America, I can, find somebody who I knew was a friend while I was in captivity. I'm just speculating here.
That's a good point. He might have been just trying to play the odds and just hedge his bets, so to speak, and make sure that if the British lose, he he might end up in a better position if he helps him out a little bit. So I'm sure Washington was just thrilled to see Charles Lee. So anyway, the British are packing up. They're leaving Philadelphia on June 12th. This is 1778. Clinton marched the army across the Delaware River and across New Jersey. Charles Lee advised Washington not to pursue Clinton's army. And you know, Washington likes to attack when he can. He's an aggressive general. But again, he doesn't make foolhardy, stupid attacks. Lee says, don't do this. It's not going to go well. Washington said, you know what, I'm going to do it anyway. And he decided to hit Clinton's rear guard. And then he makes a big mistake here. Again, Washington really, I don't know why he did this. He put Lee in charge of the operation. So you're scratching your head, George. What are you thinking here? Charles Lee just said he didn't think this was a good idea. He didn't want to attack. Great. Now go lead an attack on him. I mean, you know his heart's not going to be in it. It's like Longstreet at the Battle of Gettysburg. General Lee gave Longstreet overall command of the attack on the second day and the third day, and Longstreet didn't want to do it. And some historians have said that Longstreet purposely dogged it, at least on day 2. But anyway, I don't want to get too far off. Go listen to the Civil War series, folks, if you haven't already. But after you're done with this one.
Of course.
So anyway, so George Washington puts Charles Lee, I think he was kind of still a little bit in awe of Lee. He knew Lee was a professional soldier, and I guess he figured even though he's not really, his heart's not in it, he's a professional, he'll go get the job done. So we'll see about that. The attack force caught up with the British under Cornwallis. Cornwallis is, at this point, is basically Clinton's second in command. They catch up to the British, the Continental Army does, near Monmouth Courthouse on June 28th. Charles Lee, in overall field command, sends Anthony Wayne, there he is again, Mad Anthony, with part of the army to attack the tail of the army, while he led the rest around Cornwallis's flank to try to cut them off. Another attempted flanking movement. Lee discovered that Cornwallis had many more soldiers than he had thought. He gets around there. Oh my gosh, look at all these guys. Cornwallis, finally realizing what's going on, that the Americans are nipping at his heels, he says, all right, you want to fight? You got it. So he turns around and he attacks. Lee and the Americans are driven back. Lee orders a retreat, or at least supposedly he ordered a retreat. Washington, back behind the main force somewhat, he sees these troops retreating, and he's not real wild about retreating. He's riding forward, and he saw Lee himself retreating. He runs into Lee on the battlefield, and he goes up to Lee, and he almost loses his temper again. He says, "What does this mean, sir? Give me instantly an explanation of this retreat." And Lee was just completely caught off guard. He was just gobsmacked, or you know how sometimes somebody surprises you and you don't know what to say. So all Lee could get out of his mouth was, "Sir, sir." Washington demanded, "Why are you retreating?" And Lee replied, "Because the contradictory reports brought about a confusion that I could not control."
That's a good excuse. Wow.
Yeah. The last thing you want to admit or say if you're a commander is, "I couldn't control it. I'm not in control here," is what he's basically saying. Well, you definitely don't say that to George Washington. And he also mentioned, "Oh, by the way, I did advise against this attack." Washington told Lee he should not have even taken the command. Why did you take the command if you didn't believe in the attack? Actually, Washington had almost given it to Lafayette, but because then Lee said, "No, I'll do it after all." But anyway, so he doesn't get it done. Lee doesn't get the job done. I don't know if Lee could have done a whole lot, really, with the whole British Army turning and beginning to engage. Washington is really tough on him. But again, Lee, at least it seems Lee fails. He doesn't do the best he possibly could. Washington took personal command of the army, and he deployed it in a strong defensive position. And again, listener, you'll have to get a map. I don't want to go into much detail about the physical terrain. Clinton and Cornwallis counterattacked, but the Americans did not give way. The British fell back. So So it's not exactly a big victory for the Americans, but once again, we see the Americans fighting well, not going into a rout, not running for their lives. They're standing their ground. They're retreating once Washington rallied the troops. They're retreating in an organized manner, very slowly, holding their ground as best they can, and the British fell back. So it's kind of a draw, kind of a stalemate. Now, I want to mention a side story. This is a fun fact. The legend of Molly Pitcher. Molly Pitcher. Molly Pitcher's real name was Mary Ludwig Hayes. She was a camp follower whose job was to bring water to artillerymen, but who in this battle helped fire a cannon. If I remember the story correctly, I think one version of the story says that she was helping her husband, and her husband was wounded and couldn't fire the cannon, so she just took over and fired it herself. It's a great story. Who knows how much truth there is in it? It ought to be true if it's not true. One of those things, like some of the quotes we've mentioned, but
it could be true. So we'll leave it at that.
It could be true. Yeah. Maybe there was a lady who named Molly Pitcher, or later named that. A lot of these stories pop up many years after the event. But one thing that's definitely true is that many men on both sides in this battle died of heat stroke or exhaustion. The temperature was nearly 100 degrees. So, really hot. And of course, they're wearing these thick uniforms. Well, at least the British are. I don't know how many Americans had full uniform. Not very many. The battle was kind of a stalemate, kind of technically a loss for the Americans because the British are going to get away. They're going to continue. The Americans didn't stop the march back to Philadelphia. But again, the Americans fought well. Washington claimed it as a victory, although the British got away. He could say, hey, we weren't destroyed. We weren't totally destroyed and driven from the field. We held our ground as best we could, but the British got away. Meanwhile, after the battle, Charles Lee was court-martialed. He was found guilty of incompetence, disobedience, and insolence.
That's the real victory here in this battle of Lee's court-martial.
We get to say goodbye to Charles Lee. Oh man, I can't stand this guy. But so he's going to spend the rest of his life taking care of his dogs, his many dogs. He actually doesn't live that long, but so that's the end of Charles Lee, at least his military career. The casualties, 400 to 500 for the Americans. The British, we have no idea. Estimates go anywhere from 230 to 1,000. So perhaps if you put it somewhere in the middle, that would be about 600. So roughly equal casualties, a little bit more for the British. But once again, Washington fails to achieve his aim, which was to at least slow down, if not stop the British march back to New York. I said Philadelphia a minute ago. I'm sorry, they're leaving Philadelphia and they're heading to New York. Scott, I think you wanted to talk a little bit more about Charles. Can we just not talk about Charles Lee anymore?
just pretend he doesn't exist at all.
Yeah, you've got some more information about him possibly being a traitor.
It's not so much information, but kind of like your discussion in American History Fanatics, I've read speculation that his performance was so poor that he could only have been a traitor, that he was trying to single-handedly bring about a disastrous defeat by ordering retreat at the first chance, and that this proves that Lee was a traitor and he'd been turned during his captivity. I don't quite buy that theory, just because if you're going to be a traitor, what Benedict Arnold does make sense, where you would, and or other people have done, you simply cross enemy lines. Lee could have very easily have done that. The British perhaps could have released him, and he could have provided intelligence for different things. For him to be a mole in a command position, and for him to play this game of three-dimensional chess, there's nothing that he's done during this war to show that he's as smart or as capable of doing something like that.
Yeah, no kidding.
So I forget the quote of, do not ascribe to malice what can be explained by incompetence. And that, what I would say, is, according to Occam's razor, perhaps a better explanation for Charles Lee. So
I agree with you, Scott. I don't see him as being some kind of devious mastermind. Yeah, he's purposely dogging it. I think he just wasn't a very good commander. Mm-hmm. He said himself, I'm not in control, basically. There's a confusion I could not control. Anyway, so let's talk about the aftermath of the battle. This is the Battle of Monmouth, by the way. So last time we talked about Brandywine and Germantown, which were attempts by Washington to stop the British from getting to Philadelphia.